everyone. We're going to get started. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Thank you for coming. This is an amazing full house. So happy to see you here for this critical discussion. My name is Jessie McLaughlin, and I'm a 2L student and a member of the National Lawyers Guild and the Youth Advocacy Project. I appreciate all of you coming, and I so appreciate these panelists who've come both from New York and our good old Philly for this discussion. The panel today is titled, How We Misunderstand Mass Incarceration, Exploring the False, Nonviolent, and Violent Divide. In the past few years, there's been significant attention paid to criminal justice reform across the political spectrum. Much of this discussion has focused on reform for what has been labeled nonviolent offenses. Yet we know that many of those incarcerated are inside prisons for what has been deemed a violent offense. This dominant narrative, which is furthered by conservatives and liberals alike, has galvanized many to join this movement for reform. But at the same time, it's failed to fully recognize the complexities of what drives mass incarceration. The goal of today's panel is to explore this false narrative, false dichotomy between nonviolent and violent offenses and people that are called offenders, to explore the root causes of violence. We hope to move towards a framework that moves beyond the punishment paradigm. So these speakers will give a greater introduction than I can do, but I just want to let you know who's here. We have Movida Johnson, who's the supervisor of the Victim Services Unit in the Philadelphia District Attorney Office. We have Danielle Sered, who's an executive director of Common Justice, which works with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and crime victims to negotiate alternatives to prison for people who've committed violent felonies. We have Mark Holden, who's the policy director of the Defenders Association in Philadelphia. And we have Darren Mac, who's a social and criminal justice reform advocate and a leader in the Just Leadership USA and the movement to close Rikers Island. So with that, I would like to start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and tell the audience a little bit about how you came to this work. And I have microphones that I'm going to pass around.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So I'm Movida Johnson Harrell, and I am a native to Philadelphia. I am a Penn alum, woo. Yeah. School of Social Work, was SP2 now, class of 2004. I got into this work because I am a co-victim of homicide. I've been affected by homicide most of my life. On March 30th, 1975, Easter Sunday, my father was murdered in front of my family as he attempted to protect his sister from her domestic violence, her husband who abused her. And back then there were no victim services, and my family attempted to pick up the pieces and move on as best they could. And that's what families did, especially families of color. We used our extended family and we tried to care for one another, and you attempt to move on. And the man that was actually arrested for killing my father is still in jail over 40 years later, and he was actually not the murderer. My entire family was there and we saw the homicide. Many years later, my only brother, 2 years older than me, July 1st, 1991, was stabbed in the neck as his 5-year-old son sat in his lap over a girl. And again, my family attempted to pick up our lives and move on as best we could. And on January 13, 2011, my youngest child of 4, my 18-year-old son, Charles Andre Johnson, was murdered in a case of mistaken identity here in Philadelphia. And the irony for my family is I'm born and raised in Southwest Philadelphia, made a conscious decision to stay up until that point. In the summer of 2007, my sons came to me and said, Mom, we know 9 boys killed in our neighborhood. When my sons left my bedroom, I turned to my husband and I said, it's time to go. My black sons will not become statistics on the streets of Philadelphia. I had the means. January 15, 2008, I packed my family up and moved to Lansdowne, Delaware County. January 15, 2011, 3 years to the day I left, I buried my son. You cannot move away from the problem. 2 boys had a beef over a girl, thought my son was the boy coming back to retaliate. My son was there to pick up his sister to make sure she was safe. So I wound up getting into this movement. I was a social worker. I had my own business. And I went from being a woman who had absolutely everything she wanted to being a woman who couldn't have the one thing I wanted, which was to smell my son, to touch his skin, to kiss his neck. And I got into this movement to try to end gun violence and protect our communities, and I created the Charles Foundation. Look it up when you get an opportunity. It's thecharlesfoundation.com. Charles is an acronym for Creating Healthy Alternatives Results in Less Emotional Suffering. The Charles Foundation fights to empower young people on both sides of the gun, because going through a 2-week trial, I realized that those 2 boys that murdered my sons were also victims. They were victims of racial injustice. They were victims of social injustice. They were victims of a system that had them but did not provide the things necessary to make them whole, and they wound up committing homicide. So that led me to my work, and which led me to working with Larry Krasner, and on January 2nd, 2018, he appointed me as head of victim services for the city of Philadelphia.
Hi, my name is Mark Holden. I don't have nearly as compelling a story, so thank you for sharing that seriously. I got into this work because I had worked in foster care for quite a long time, and had seen young children who had been pulled away from their parents, and having lost my father as a child, I could very much relate to that. And what I was seeing as I was following these youth was that the same thing that was causing them the deep pain that would allow them to open up to me when they were 5, 6 years old would then slowly turn into outbursts that adults would react to aggressively. So when you get to 12 and 13, the tears would go away and the anger would show up. And then adults would be very angry. They'd call the cops. I had cops called on foster children all the time that we thought we could de-escalate. And then the connection became clear to me between trauma and the justice system, and the juvenile justice system, and the adult justice system. So I wanted to be an attorney for youth like that, and who had been through those experiences. And so that's what I did, and now I'm in the position of the first policy director at the Defender Association, where we are in fact trying to both change the narrative but significantly reduce the use of incarceration, which is a very difficult conversation to have, because we do want to be very sensitive to the real victims of crime and survivors of crime, not minimize that and act as though there isn't true meaningful harm. And I really appreciate the conversations we can now have with the district attorney's office and with the community, so we can talk about these issues without positioning each other like one of us is on the side of the, quote, bad people and someone's on the side of the good people. Just that feels like that's already falling down, and we can actually have these conversations that get to the root of the problems we're all trying to solve.
I was going to offer a less personal introduction, but I forgot Movida would be here, and that would not be an option. I grew up in Chicago. I came of age in Chicago in the late 80s and early 90s, which is the last time that city saw the levels of violence that it's seeing today. My family was touched by that violence. I buried people who were too young to die when I was too young to bury people. I survived violence myself, but also because of the historical moment that it was the moment when mass incarceration was beginning to unfold in this country into the beast it's become. And so it was new to us. The scale of it was new to us. And so we would see people go away, and usually we talk about them being like down south. There was so much stigma and so much shame associated with it, a great deal of secrecy. And people would come back from prison and would typically come back worse. I believe the thing that prison is best designed to attack is the thing in us that like makes me feel pain when you suffer. Some people come through that experience with that part of themselves fully intact. We should have great reverence for people who have that kind of fortitude of spirit. Many of us wouldn't. I'm humble enough to know that I might or might not in the context of what that place is. And so people came home, were worse for it, and hurt people. And like all of us, we start with the people closest to us and work our way out. So I saw that harm unfold in families. I saw it on my block. I saw it in our communities. And at the same time, I thought, that surely what we were doing must be good for someone, right? It was bad for the people who were locked up and not making them better. It was bad for the people they loved. It was bad for our neighborhoods, but surely it must be good for the victims, right? That's what we were being told. And I started paying attention to my own experience as a survivor and the experience of survivors around me. And the first thing that was clear is far fewer of us wanted prison than any of the media conversation made us believe. Like, it's just not what we saw. We wanted to change our locks. We wanted to move or not have to move. We wanted space to grieve. We wanted time off work. We wanted our loved ones to be safe. We wanted not to go through that pain ever again. We wanted changes to the things that made violence likely in the first place. And some of us wanted prison. And even those who did, those who got it, it never healed them. Because at the end of the day, like, punishment doesn't resolve trauma. It would be simpler if it did, but it doesn't. And at the same time that I came to terms with that, I was getting in trouble because I was an adolescent. And I got out of that trouble because I was white. I was white then too. And just keeping track of the story. And in the most, as white folks, we are diverted all the time. Like, constantly, at every decision, at nearly every decision point. People err on the side of our freedom. They err on the side of our human development. They err on the side of our humanity. And that doesn't mean terrible things don't happen to us. They do. But it almost always will tip in our favor, and far more than it ever will for folks of color. And so, as I got in a lot of trouble, and the most dramatic of those kind of lessons about that disparity, I was brought up on a range of charges I won't specify here. My record is sealed. You think I'm the poster child for victimization. I'm also the poster child for expungement. Look at the career I've made with my clean record. And so I got 6 months of community service cleaning fire trucks. My co-defendant, we were both 15. He was a young black man. Got 6 years of hard time. His 18th birthday was transferred to an adult prison. Was assaulted, we believe sexually assaulted, though he never said, was attacked later by the same man, and made a decision I've had to make in other contexts where when someone vastly overpowers you, you either cause serious harm or you submit to what the harm they are trying to cause. He hurt this man more than he meant to, got another bit on top of the original one, and is still doing time for our shared mistakes. And that lesson at that time made a couple things clear to me. The thing it made clear to me immediately was that I came to understand the racial inequity in that system as someone who benefited from it. And so I understood that it was going to be my job to find people who were fighting that inequity and join with them until either we won or I died, whichever came first. And the second thing I understood that didn't register for me deeply until much later as I started to build out the body of work I now do is that the criminal justice system could do what it wanted to. Like, it could act humanely when it chose to, that it didn't require changes in legislation. It required changes in the exercise of discretion. That young man and I were the same age in front of the same judge facing the same charges. The options that were available for me were available for him. And so I also came to understand that when we think about the transformation of the criminal justice system, we have to think not only about changes in law, which are important, and they're important, honestly, constraints on negative behavior, but also think about creating pathways that allow the people within that system to act humanely, and more that require them to do that. So I'll stop.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Mac, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And one of the things that brought me into this work is that I'm one of 70 million people in our country who has a criminal conviction. So at the age of 17, I was arrested for being an accomplice to a robbery, and ultimately I was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. During that time, actually I was on Rikers Island when the population was about 20,000 people incarcerated at Rikers. Today it's about 8,300, and no spotlight was on Rikers on that time. And it was a place, and still is a place, where you're either a predator or prey. And during this time when I was on Rikers Island, I was in solitary confinement, and I received a letter from my cousin, who also was put inside this letter a cutout article from a newspaper about a distant relative by the name of George Stinney Jr. George Stinney Jr. From in South Carolina, he was in less than 83 days. He was arrested, wrongly arrested, accused, went to trial by all-white male jury, and was convicted of killing 2 young white girls. And he was convicted and sentenced to the electric chair. He got the electric chair. And George Stinney Jr. was 14 years old. So when I read about this story, this was like a pivotal moment for me, because here I was, being held accountable for my actions, and here's George, who, by the same justice system, who only crime was being black and a scapegoat. And that was a pivotal moment that changed, that transformed my mindset about, criminal justice work. Years later, during my incarceration, I had the opportunity to be accepted to a program called Bar College's Bar Prison Initiative. And I was on a history track, learning about history, and it was one history course that was taught by one of my favorite professors, who's also my mentor, Dr. Delia Mellis. She taught a course on U.S. women's history, and I learned about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York during the early 1900s. And during this time, it was young. I mean, like teenagers and young immigrant women in their 20s who organized around labor conditions. And this was like really inspiring and motivational for me to see like these young immigrant women who had all these intersectional oppressions against them to organize against, corporations and, CEOs and, the capitalist system. And that was a moment in me that I basically wanted to get involved with social justice work. So that's basically like a catalyst for like how I got into like, social justice and criminal justice reform work, once I returned back to society in 2012.
Thank you for sharing your stories, and I think the personal nature of them is very indicative of how much this problem is hitting close to home, how personal it is, how this is not just a system out there, it's in here, it's among us. And I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about the question, which I think all of you brought up, about harm. How do you think about in your work both redressing harm, real harm that occurs, and also what it means to move beyond a punishment paradigm, and what does that look like? Anyone who speaks, and then I have some individual questions.
So I think we've made a really grave mistake in this country in conflating punishment and accountability, which are not the same thing. I actually believe that in many ways they're antithetical to each other, which is why, as one of the punishingest nations in human history, we have a total lack of accountability throughout our culture. And so when I say accountability, I mean a fairly straightforward set of things. I mean acknowledging what you have done, acknowledging the impact of those actions, expressing genuine remorse, making things as right as possible, ideally in ways defined by the people harmed, and becoming someone who won't commit that harm ever again. That work, right, that labor of accountability is harder than anything we'll ever do in being punished. Punishment can be degrading, it can be dehumanizing. It doesn't require anything of us except that we don't escape, right? It is done to us. It's a fundamentally passive thing to be punished. I believe that when we hurt people, we owe something, period. I believe we owe it to repair the harm we've done. I believe that obligation is situated deeply, like it is rooted in our humanity. It is rooted in our human dignity. And so nothing erases that human obligation. And I believe prisons, in every single way they're structured, run contrary to each of those steps as places that foster separation, that foster denial, that prevent connection, that prevent repair, that inhibit transformation, that they run contrary to the core things that actually constitute accountability. And at the same time, they are defined by the very things that drive violence. So I'm in the business of trying to end violence. The core drivers of violence on the individual level, so I'm not talking about structural ones like poverty and white supremacy, which are the real origins if you want to get to what has to be uprooted to end violence in America and globally. But on the individual level, the things that drive violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. I would argue the 4 core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. It means our central response to violence in America has baked into it precisely the things that generate violence. That is not what a nation that wants peace does. It is not what a nation committed to survivors does. It is not what a nation that seeks safety does. And so when I think about moving beyond punishment, I actually don't think the primary reason to do that has to be about our deep empathy for people who are incarcerated and who've caused harm. I love many people who are and have been incarcerated. I care deeply about what happens to people in our nation's jails and prisons. But I think the moral call to us as a nation to end mass incarceration can be just as deeply rooted in a commitment to survivors and a commitment to safety as it is rooted in a commitment to people who are locked up.
Absolutely. That was amazing. So to add on to what Danielle just said, you know, historically we have made the decisions for the masses, right? And typically there are people that are not at the table, that their voices aren't being raised, and they're typically on the menu. So I think when we talk about people with privilege, that it is our responsibility to make sure that those voices who are not typically raised, those people who are not typically included in the conversation, those people who are not typically seated at the table are included, that we make space, that we include those voices, that we raise those voices, because those voices are going to help to induce change in our society. If you talk to most victims, all victims do not want punitive consequences for their offenders. Many victims understand that they may need drug treatment, or they may need social services, or they may need a variety of things to help them, to keep them from reoffending, but we're typically telling victims what they want opposed to asking victims what they want. We need to include them in the conversation and not make the decision for them. Law enforcement in America has typically been, it's going to be a white person saving the day by prosecuting this person and getting them the maximum amount of time, which if we really want to manage victims' expectations, then we want to ask them, what is it that you would like to see happen in this situation? What is it that you want? We need to take away that unrealistic expectation that we are going to make the victim whole. I don't care how you've been victimized, you will never be whole again. What we need to do is to help them determine how they can move forward. And as a society, that means the offender also, because in many, many instances, that offender has been victimized too.
I think like they basically summed it up. The only thing I would add is like one of the slogans of Just Leadership USA is those closest to the problem is closest to the solution, yet furthest from the resources and power. So if we think about any movement that happened in our country, whether it's the women's rights movement or civil rights movement, you know, how could you have a conversation about women's rights and not have women at the table? Likewise, how could you have, you know, a conversation about criminal justice reform and not have people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system at the table? You know, my experience as a person who's been impacted by the justice system, I can tell you that there's nothing good. There's very, very little good that's happening within the system. You know, fortunately, you know, the Bar College and other colleges and universities are bringing education into the system, you know, without public funding, mostly by private donors, and it's transformative. You know, I think it was 1995 when Bill Clinton, the Omnibus Crime Bill that eliminated Pell Grants for incarcerated students, which was like less than 1% of the total Pell Grants funding, and studies have shown that every dollar that you spend in educating an incarcerated student, you save $4 to $5 because it puts them in a better position to get employed when they return back to society. So whoever made that decision, definitely wasn't working in the interests of our society. And the fight is continuing. There's discussions right now to reinstate Pell Grant. So everything that they spoke of is true, and we need to actually reevaluate the direction that we go in the criminal justice reform, because it is a bipartisan issue, like you said, but for different reasons. Mm-hmm. For some is a moral reason, for others it's a fiscal reason. And yeah, I'll stay before I get in trouble. I'll keep it at that.
I don't have that much to add myself. I think as a white person doing this work, I feel it's really important to, in fact, involve the community every step of the way, share information and power, and then move out of the way. I don't actually like to be the one who says things about solutions. I would much rather be a conduit of information to the people who are closest to the problem, and then let those solutions carry forward and then amplify those. So one thing our office does is participatory defense, getting the community to come together to support people who are accused of crimes. And what's really telling to me is that the first family justice hub in Philadelphia is at a place called Mothers in Charge, which is in fact an organization founded by a woman who lost her son to violence, for other parents and mothers who lost their children to violence, who sees the value of supporting people who are accused of crimes as well, who is themselves breaking down the dichotomy between the people who are quote offenders and quote victims. And in my work, if we can build those hubs and then get out of the way and let the community come to court, let the community have the policy solutions, then we're going to get much further than intellectual policy wonks arguing about who's a victim and who is not. That's nonsense. And I would just encourage anyone who goes into this work, if you feel like you have the privilege, find a way to make the space to not make it about your voice, but make it about someone else's.
Thank you. Mothers in Charge spoke last year. They were amazing. So I'm interested, and I think Danielle, when you spoke about the fact that prisons are actually, founded on continuing to hurt people based on how we know people are hurt. I'm curious what work you think this dichotomy or false dichotomy between violent and non-violent offenders is doing. Why do we have this divide? What is it doing in sort of media, in our culture, in our ability to reform or not reform our systems?
So I think we have to be really clear that the responsibility for the narrative about violent versus nonviolent crime does not rest with our opposition. It rests with us. The people who have advanced reforms for nonviolent crimes are the people who have done the most to advance those narratives and those distinctions. And I want to be really clear about a distinction between targeted strategic policy aims and the narrative approaches to win those aims. Policy is filthy work. No purist. If you're a purist, don't do policy. It's dirty, it's nasty, it's ugly compromises, it's always wrong. That's what it is. If you love it, do it. But don't. If you're a purist, don't fuck with it. It's not pure. And so policy work, you will pick what you can win, and you will win it, and you will win it in imperfect ways, and that's just real. Everything that's been won has been won that way. That said, the compromises you make on what's winnable do not have to translate into compromises about how you argue for that win in the public discourse. And so you can argue for the release of people who've committed drug-related offenses from prison without saying they're not the bad ones, they're not the real monsters. Don't put them in prison with the truly dangerous people who through sheer proximity will make them worse. You don't have to win by contrast. You don't have to win the release of juveniles by talking about the fact that they are capable of change in a way no adult is. You understand the implications of that for anyone trying to free adults. And so there are ways, while policy will always require Like only certain things are going to win. You win the things you can. It's inherently incremental. That is what it is. The narrative work to do it and the movement-oriented work to support those victories don't have to reflect that same kind of compromise. And it's incredibly harmful when it does. And there are, I think, two main problems with our failure to address violence and to include violence in the scope of what we imagine transforming. The first of those is numerical. So more than half of people incarcerated in state prisons and jails are there for crimes of violence. We will not reduce incarceration by more than half by ignoring more than half of people who are in. And when I say reduce incarceration by more than half, if that rings to anyone as super ambitious, I'd ask you to scale back your estimation of it. The day I was born, there were 443,850 people locked up in America. If we have any data statistician types in the room, keep my age to yourself. I had someone who guessed it within a month when I shared that. Todd Clare was like, January. I was like, you know what? No one likes you. And so... I'm like, the thing I just said on the record about Todd Clare is that no one likes him. I love Todd Clare. And so 443,850 in our lifetimes, right? Like the scale of mass incarceration is brand new. And so when we talk about reducing incarceration by half even, we're conceding a threefold increase in my lifetime, which despite the opinions of the adolescents I work with day in and day out is not actually all that long. And so from a numerical perspective, we have to include violence if we want to achieve anywhere near a moral and effective goal. But the second reason we have to include violence is that the fundamental moral argument, the cultural war we are undergoing about whether or not incarceration will continue to define who we are as a nation, is about violence. People don't give up roads and hospitals and schools and higher education and everything else we could spend money on for people who commit petty theft or to lock up people who have drug addiction issues. We make those decisions as a nation because of a story we're told about who is dangerous, about some imagined monstrous other from whom we have to be protected at any cost, moral or financial. That story is the story at the heart of structural racism, the story of someone who is different from white folks in particular, who is different in a way that is inherently dangerous, who has to be managed through force and power. It is a centuries-old story. And if we don't come for that story, we will trim the edges of the thing and it will continue to grow. Like, I'm not actually great with houseplants, but I do know that all the ones that thrive get trimmed all the time. Like, trimming doesn't shrink a thing. Coming for the roots does. And so if we avoid the fundamental cultural debate, if we avoid the moral debate that's at the heart of the question of the role incarceration plays in our nation, we will always, always lose no matter what. And so as someone who is interested in winning, I don't think we have a choice but to steer into it.
You might have covered it. I want to let you know that there's some 1Ls in the room who are going to have to leave at 12:45 for class, so they're not being rude. They have to go. I'd like to move in a little bit to the practical ways you do your work in thinking about this issue. So, Mark, I'm curious how you see the false dichotomy between nonviolent and violent crime play out in your daily work at the Defenders. And specifically, I'm thinking about what does it look like for a defender, doing their job representing someone in court, and what does it look like for you thinking about policy?
Should I wait a sec? No. What's that?
Maybe wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's wait just one.
That's what happens when you turn it over to me. I'm just kidding. Right.
So many 1Ls.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so again, the question is basically in thinking about Mark's work at the Defender Association, how this false dichotomy plays out, both in the work of a daily defender doing their work of representing someone, and then in your work as a policy director.
Yeah, so one of the things that I worked on with one of our attorneys was creating a specialized program to represent women who have been victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, who then get arrested for a crime against the person who abused them. And it actually was really interesting to make that focus because we often represent men in domestic violence cases. And for our attorneys to like wrap their head around the fact that we are going to use the fact that someone's been a survivor of violence to mitigate the harm and kind of flip it back on the abuser, I think was hard for some people to understand. Like, are we violating our sort of ethical principles? And that's the kind of way that I think defense lawyers can play into this dichotomy, the thinking that just because you represent someone means you somehow have to always stand on their side no matter what they've done and no matter the harm that they've caused that creates a ripple effect. And I guess I'll just say also in terms of policy, I really like what you said, and it makes me want to switch roles because it is dirty and weird. But what you said is really, but what you said is really important because I spent a lot of time working on risk assessments, and especially in the bail context. And to me, the crux of why the bail system is so flawed is not because there's cash involved. That's really terrible. It's because we think we can predict dangerousness, and that's an appropriate consideration at bail hearings. That is the problem. That was not even a thing in the law that was codified until the Federal Bail Reform Act of 1984. Bail has dated back centuries and centuries, since before this country. And so the fact that we actually, in every crime that's charged in Philadelphia and other jurisdictions, we want to start using risk to predict whether someone's going to get arrested again as a proxy for violence, even if you're arrested on a K&I, possession, even if you're arrested on a nonviolent offense. If you're arrested on a, quote, violent offense, you're presumed innocent. This narrative, I mean, this is absurd that we actually believe that that's an okay thing to do. And people that I work with on this issue are afraid to challenge preventive detention and dangerousness as a basis for holding someone pre-trial. If we're afraid to amplify that issue, if organizers and activists and policy folks are afraid to talk about that, we will never reverse this. And that eats at me. And people tell me I can't talk about that or that that's too radical. But if we don't end preventive detention, I honestly don't think we can end any of this because that pretrial detention is the precursor to post-trial detention.
Thank you. Wow. Darren, you and I were talking earlier, and I think it's related to some of what you're talking about, Mark, about how we actually think about the kinds of changes we're building. And so right now there's been a movement to close Rikers Island that you have been very involved in. And I'm curious if you can speak about, have you confronted this narrative in your work to close Rikers Island? I imagine you have. And now that there's a plan put out, how is this narrative actually existing in terms of what we rebuild or build instead of prisons?
Yeah, so
Push the button.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a long fight. So 2016, one of the first campaigns that Just Leadership USA launched was a Close Rikers campaign on the steps of City Hall in New York. And for a very long time, it was led by directly impacted people, organizing, hounding the mayor. People probably know the story. And it wasn't until like a week before this report came out that the mayor, during an election year, said he's committed to closing Rikers. So I think it was like he did it for political reasons. It was an election year. I still don't believe that he's committed to closing Rikers, but yeah, the question, when that question comes up, like that's the main question. Like, what are we going to do with everybody if we close Rikers? Well, nowhere in our history will we close the jail and everybody just running the streets and stuff like that. So I don't even know like how people could imagine that. But sometimes that question comes from a place that's like has a historical lineage to, like once you free everybody, what you going to do with all these people? But I usually hit people with like facts and numbers. Like 79% of the people on Rikers Island haven't been convicted of a crime. They're basically because they can't pay bail. Like they too poor to pay bail. And I always mention, like, if we think about a big city, if we just imagine a big city where, like Berlin, and we know the history of Germany, and 89% of the people in the biggest jail in that city, if they was poor Jewish people, how would that look? 89% of the people on Rikers Island are Black and Latino, and we know the history of our country. For some people, they didn't even think of that, about that in that manner. For others, they reflect on that, like, that's a problem. So yeah, I hear people like facts like that, that people, most of the people, majority of people out there haven't been convicted of a crime. And yeah, the plan is a lot of plans out there. Basically, the mayor plans to build smaller, safer borough-based facility next to the closed Rikers. People are kind of pushing back on that, for various reasons. Because of NIMBYism, or because communities that have been impacted by Rikers have been historically under-resourced in schools and education. Now you come in with this $1 billion jail in our neighborhood. That's the investment you want to make. So it's a lot of pushback, and people, it's hard. It's hard. It's complex. Rikers Island was the third largest mental health institution in our country. There's more people in there that these services, like 40% of the people on Rikers Island, like have been diagnosed with mental health issues. 60% women have been diagnosed with mental health issues. There's a lot of things that we need in our community. That's why I usually just, when I speak about the campaign, I just basically reiterate the campaign slogan, which is close Rikers, build communities. And I think that's what's needed in our time. We need to think of new ways to hold people accountable without what we've been doing previously, which hasn't been working. The fear mongering is what got us into this mess of mass incarceration. So yeah, that's how I usually try to address it in those manners.
Right.
Can I just add a local spin on what you just said? Because when Just Leadership came to Philly to announce the Close the Creek campaign, to close the House of Corrections, right before that happened, the mayor made an announcement that he was going to close the House of Corrections, taking the wind out of Just Leadership, USA's sails, and kind of spinning it into a political game because they knew they could not fight back against it. So I just want to put into context that the same thing happened in Philly, and it's really worrisome that politicians will take that and then try to make it their own, and then kind of wrap their arms around the issue and then not really let true reform happen.
Thank you. And it seems like partly what you're both talking about is actually really engaging in and investing in a cultural shift and doing more than just saying we're going to put out a plan that looks sort of like a little bit nicer prison than we had before, or a little bit less violent system than we had before. Movida, in your work, I'm interested in your work on restorative justice, thinking about restorative justice both as a mother and in your role in Krasner's Victim Services Unit. How do you think about the role that restorative justice can and should play in harm reduction?
So the restorative justice component at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office is totally new with DA Larry Krasner. And one of the things that the DA realizes is that justice is not blind, right? So we have these pictures, these images of Lady Justice with the blindfold on, and there's these scales that says there's equality and there is not. And he realizes that. And one of the things that he decided when he took office was, one of the reasons why he decided to run in the first place for district attorney was that he wanted to balance the scales. He wanted to help in mass incarceration, he wanted to raise the voice of the victim, and he wanted to come up with solutions that included people on both sides of that line, right? So now we have restorative justice in the Office of Victim Services. I have a restorative justice facilitator, her name is Jody Dodd, and she's specifically working on initiatives to include in the DAO, including the district attorney's office, pre-conviction, pre-arrest. I have had the privilege of going to New York to see Common Justice with Danielle. We're scheduled to go out to San Diego to see Impact Justice with Sujatha. So we're looking at different models around the country that we can bring to Philadelphia so that we can create programs, diversion programs, restorative justice programs that include both the quote unquote offender and the victims, so that it will reduce. We know that if we invest in people as opposed to prisons, that we do reduce recidivism. And that's the goal, is to keep people from using prisons as a revolving door, because we know that there is disparity in economics. We know that there is no economic justice, that there is racial injustice, that there is social injustice. And as Danielle said earlier, we can hold people accountable without locking them up, right? And it should not just be limited, and the DA understands this, it should not just be limited to nonviolent crimes. Because some of the best results that we've gotten have been, I've been to Common Justice, I've talked to the young people in those programs. I've talked to young people who have had charges with guns and who are participating, who have created contracts and fulfilled their obligation and met with their victims and written letters and gone to school. And I have heard that judge who knows each and every victim by name, who knows their children's name, who is invested and engaged and empowered and really looks for solutions for these young people and these old people, right? Because it's not just for young people. So the DA is looking to bring some of this beautiful and innovative and empowering work to Philadelphia, because we realize that if we empower the people, we will empower communities and we will reduce violence.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect segue in talking about what to do in Philly and the work you are doing to think about that to Danielle. And Danielle, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your work at Common Justice, and particularly how you've built support for alternative to incarceration programs that work with folks who have been in violent felonies or have violent felony charges. And I'm wondering also what resistance you encountered as you've built this out.
Sure. I started Common Justice out of the Vera Institute of Justice. I did that because Vera was willing to bet its 50-year really extraordinary reputation on my idea. I understood that if I went to the district attorney at the time and was like, I've got this idea that I've been coming up with on my laptop at my kitchen table, and I'd like the people who commit violent felonies, that we wouldn't launch. And so really found people with credibility who were willing to leverage it in the interest of something different and new. We divert, just so it's clear, we divert serious and violent felonies, including first and second degree robberies and assaults, so shootings, stabbings, gunpoint robberies, into a restorative justice process and violence intervention program. It's about 15 months for the responsible parties. That's what we call, what other people call, defendants and offenders. And in that process, they prepare for the dialogue. They reach agreements with the person they hurt about how they can make things as right as possible. They fulfill those agreements, and they go through an intensive violence intervention program we've designed. And at the same time, we work with the people who they harmed to help them come through what happens to them and in their lives generally. I think early, our first years, we were under District Attorney Joe Hines, who was subsequently defeated by District Attorney Ken Thompson. May he rest in peace. And I think Joe Hines misunderstood risk in a certain way. So he was always, DAs are terrified that they will divert someone, that person will commit a new crime, that they will be dragged through the dirt in the media, and they will lose their jobs. It's the fundamental fear that elected officials have about doing really brave and forward-thinking diversion work. And it's rooted in some history of that happening to people, but not as much history or as recent history as people seem to believe. So it's increasingly true that the public has an understanding that not every alternative will be perfect. The public has an understanding that prison is imperfect. And so the rage against an imperfect prosecutor for diverting somebody is just not what it once was. It's not kind of Willie Horton days anymore. But I think the thing that will predict, there's this whole wave of progressive prosecutors being elected across the country, which is exciting and important. And I think that my hypothesis is that we can predict which of them will fulfill their promises and which don't based on a particular piece of data. We'll see if this is right. And the piece of data is about who elected them. So in some of these jurisdictions, prosecutors are being elected by the same people who are likely voters, who have been likely voters for a really long time. They're challenging incumbents who are maybe out of step with the public, or who have had issues around corruption or other things where they can defeat them on those grounds. But they're fundamentally drawing from a pool of voters that is primarily white, primarily middle class and affluent, primarily not directly impacted by violence and incarceration, but who have an appetite for slightly more progressive shifts. Those prosecutors, I think, will move slowly, if at all. And that's not about what their intentions are. It's about what they'll be able to do politically. There are another group of prosecutors who have won by mobilizing new bases of support. So when Ken Thompson won in Brooklyn, he turned out the vote in Bed-Stuy and in East New York and in Brownsville and in the neighborhoods and he got enough of the white liberal vote, and he certainly got enough of the white donors, which he needed. But his biggest base of support were in communities whose lives were impacted by the work his office would do. And what that meant was that his risk tolerance, so he did braver things in many ways than his predecessor. I don't necessarily believe that's because he was a fundamentally braver man. My opinion of those two men as humans is irrelevant. The reason he was able to do that is he was accountable to a different constituency, and politicians' risk tolerance reflect their constituency's risk tolerance. And by constituency, I mean the likely voters. So not who lives in their district, but who votes in their district. And so in communities where incarceration is common, new solutions are not regarded as wildly innovative risks. I've compared it imagine if you're suffering from horrible migraines and have been for a decade, and someone says to you there's a new medication that is, has only had a small study but has really strong results. Do you want to try it? You say yes, and you don't say yes because you're like risk and innovation. You say yes because the status quo is unbearable, because you cannot abide the pain of what is currently true any longer. And so choosing something else isn't risky or innovative or even progressive, it's pragmatic. And that's true in communities across the country whose neighborhoods and families have been ravaged by the failed experiment of incarceration. And so when those communities are the ones voting and are the ones moving a prosecutor into office, they become the communities to whom those prosecutors will be accountable. And in doing that, they fundamentally change that prosecutor's risk tolerance, because they know, Dia Gonzalez now in Brooklyn knows he won't lose his next election for diverting someone who commits a new crime. If he loses his next election, it's because he will not have kept his promise of moving as far or as boldly enough as he told people he would move. That's not because of who he is as a man. It's because of who the people are who put him there in the first place.
Thank you. And I think that really shifts, the conversation about actually who should be, making these decisions and shifting our conversation. So I want to turn it over to the audience and see if you have questions for our four amazing panelists. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Zishan, and I'm an LLM student. So I'm an international student. I'm from Pakistan. So I loved your discussion, by the way. It was very good. I just want to know, you talked about racial discrimination and how it plays in criminal justice system. But there are other factors as well, like race, religion, gender, national origin. I'm just curious, can you share your personal stories or something that how they play out in the criminal justice system?
So, thank you for your question, and that's an important question that needs to be discussed over and over and over again. So, in New York City, they have this policing practice called broken windows policing. I don't know if they have it here. So basically, what it is based upon this theory that if you have say a car and a window is broken, that if it's not fixed, then people will demolish the car, and more crime will basically escalate to happen. So if you go after the small minor infractions, the minor violation or minor offenses, it'll eliminate or deter people from committing bigger bigger offenses or, infractions. So they have this practice in New York City, but it's racially targeted to communities of color, like people jumping a turnstile, people smoking, marijuana in public, people like writing graffiti and what they call quality of life issues. And right now you have 12 NYPD officers who are suing the NYPD because they practice in one, broken windows policing only in communities of color, and two, that they have a quota system, that they have to make write a certain amount of summonses for the month or the year in order to get promotion or not get fired and do their job. And these two things are only implemented in the communities of color. The New York Times just exposed information about that whites and people of color smoke marijuana at the same amount, at the same rates. They get the same amount of calls for about 911, but people of color are arrested for it. Much more, twice, sometimes 3 times more than whites. They exposed that, and now the NYPD is like, oh, we got to investigate that. They had this data already. They making an arrest. It's their data, their information. They knew this already, but they was called out on it. So that's like one way of how race plays a factor, and class, plays a factor in policing and in the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of information out there about that. I know that the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, he argued in front of the Supreme Court like 4 times. He was the one that had overturned sentencing juveniles to they say life in prison, but it's actually death in prison. We like the only country in the world that sentenced teenagers to die in prison. And he argued in front of the Supreme Court, got that overturned. And those numbers are basically like racially disproportionate impact people of color. So there's evidence across the board from arrest to incarceration that shows, what you said about the race and class and gender. In regard to gender, women are being incarcerated more than ever now within the last, decade or two. Like it's like over like a 600% increase of women being incarcerated. So gender plays a factor. Well, we could go through the long history about the LGBTQ community being criminalized, into the system. So you said it right. It definitely plays a factor, and we have to keep discussing that, bringing it to the public, and challenging that. And I conclude with that.
Any other questions? Yeah, Ian.
Hi, my name's Ian. Thank you so much for all coming in and for sharing some deeply personal stories. So one issue that we often talk about is the problem of mandatory minimums, specifically in the context of violent offenses. So I was just wondering if in any of your work you've had experiences in kind of trying to communicate or working with legislators or rule makers or people that work on these sentencing commissions to kind of change that economy of what it means or what violent offenses mean and kind of the effects of mandatory minimums, and how you've been trying to bridge the gap between these people and communities that are being affected by violent crimes.
So is this on? I have a bit of experience working against mandatory minimums, but the way we did it in Pennsylvania is through litigation that found mandatory minimums unconstitutional, and then the lawmakers in Pennsylvania were trying to actually bring it back. And what we say to the lawmakers is like not at all like transformative, right? That does not get to the folks in Harrisburg. But I will say that the Sentencing Commission of Pennsylvania was trying to create a sentencing risk assessment tool, which we aggressively tried to defend against, and we blocked it for at least 6 months with a huge showing from the community. The year before, we had 3 people testify against it in Philly. This past summer, we had 25 people testify against it. Victims of crimes, police officers, people formerly incarcerated, and we were able to build a movement against it. And one of the things that I want to go back to about race, I don't know if this is far afield from your question, but it's important because the Sentencing Commission said, well, yes, we will label people of color high risk more often than white people. They admit that. The reason they say is because there's different base rates. What that means is, that's code for what they will not say directly, which is people of color, they believe, commit more crimes than white people. So there's some level of disparity that's okay. The fact that people of color were 34% more likely to be labeled high risk was not a problem that they created. It was a problem that that group, people of color, created for themselves. That is what they claim, even though the very data that they're relying upon is law enforcement behavior. It's arrest rates. It's not what people have done. We don't have good data that reflects people's race for actions that they have committed themselves. Pennsylvania barely is able to keep data on people of Hispanic origin, like Latinx populations. They can't even keep that data. It's not this just you're black or you're white, and it must be reflective of actual behavior. So that's how deep this gets, and that's the thing we pushed back against. And I think that's a really important conversation to have, and I think a lot of people are afraid to have it or afraid to recognize that that is a reality we have to contend with. Because the solution would be something like affirmative action, in a way. Corrective weights for arrests if you're a person of color. Maybe if you're going to use a risk assessment tool, an arrest does not count the same because you're much more likely to be arrested if you're a person of color. If that makes you uncomfortable, good, because that's the conversation we have to have. And if we can't find that line, then we can't use algorithms in criminal justice.
Thank you. Wow. And I think for those of us in law school, we know how criminal law is taught. We know the biases that are taught. I mean, and thinking about what it actually means to try to challenge that as students, as future lawyers. I just can't help but comment on that given what you're saying about data and sort of this framework of objective knowledge as though it's somehow truth when we know that it isn't. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a last question. No? Yes, Fatu.
If you all can speak maybe a bit more about sort of the intersections between mass incarceration and police brutality in a sense, and how we should consider the two given our futures as legal advocates in this area. I know it's a very broad question.
So, yeah, it's an important question. I think police. So the police are the people who are the part of the criminal justice system that are closest to the people, and their behavior and what behavior we authorize is a reflection of what we believe that system's job is in a society. The behavior that we authorize from police in America is behavior you would expect from an occupying army. It's behavior rooted in aggression and enmity and separation and force. You can't have that define your police force and have the system that follows from it be anything other than those things. And so the idea that mass incarceration and the behavior of police are sort of separate issues, I appreciate you bringing them together because they're often worked on separately. But the behavior of police is in many ways the strongest and most consistent communication to our public about what criminal justice is, what its function is, what we regard as its role in our society. And we have to understand the lineage of those kinds of enforcements. Like, we have to understand the lineage of policing and slave patrols in America. Like, it's just real. And if we can't talk about that lineage, if we can't talk about the first publicly funded law enforcement being the first, like, there's a great book called Our Enemies in Blue that traces this trajectory, but that, slave owners, like people who thought they could own a human being, right? And at first, when the people they thought they owned escaped, they would chase them down. And then they were like, you know what, we should take turns. Like, because if only two of us go out, then two of us can stay on the porch and drink gin and we can sort of swap out over time. And then they were like, you know what, even better, what if we hire somebody to chase down people who were trying to escape and protect us from rebellion and protect our property as they conceived of it. And then they were like, well, hey, we're the richest people in our jurisdictions. Like, we shouldn't have to pay someone. We should make the jurisdiction pay. Like, this is crime. Like, this is theft. And the first paid police officers in this country, like, grow out of that lineage. Like, if we don't contend with that lineage, it remains everywhere. Like, there is not a way forward that doesn't reckon with the past. And so I believe really deeply that the way we've advanced change as it relates to racial justice in this country is a lot like when there is a settlement where the offending party agrees to pay out but with no admission of guilt. Like, that's what America has done. We're like, we'll give you this much, but we will not admit to wrongdoing. The problem is, like, for what like people like Movida and I know from restorative justice perspective is absent acknowledgement. Like, the payout is never going to transform a thing. I mean, people should pay, let's be clear, but it will never transform a thing. And so I believe that we have gotten exactly as far as we can get in this country in advancing progress toward racial justice without telling the truth about our past. I believe, like, Barack Obama and his beautiful family were the last drop we could squeeze out from that story. And I believe the only way forward is through reckoning. I think that is clearer and clearer and clearer every day in this country. People don't generally choose a reckoning. Reckonings are hard. They are painful. They involve a total rearrangement of power. They are not, like, the end is not guaranteed at the beginning. But I don't think there's another path forward in America but through it. And so that's a broad answer to, I managed to broaden your question that was already broad rather than narrow it. But I think the place that policing and mass incarceration intersect in all sorts of functional ways, but they also intersect really deeply in the psyche and the history of this nation. And they will not transform absent a transformation of that psyche and a reckoning with that history.
Yeah, what she said. It's a lot. Like, one of the things I thought about was, like, one of the first public resistance against police brutality was the Black Panther Party self-defense. And we know at the state, the way they responded was the implementation of the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which basically was clear to neutralize, people and movements like that. And I think it was like this year, the New York Times, someone from the Nixon administration came out publicly and said that the war on drugs was specifically to target blacks and hipsters who was like hippies, who was basically like speaking out against the Vietnam War to control them. So you had the racial factor and the class factor, the war, and the war on drugs is basically one of the things that drove mass incarceration. So all of that is connected. One good book that I would like suggest that like everyone would read, especially if you're going to be an attorney, a lawyer, is a book called The Assassination of Fred Hampton. Mm-hmm. It was written by a lawyer himself. My professor Delia Mellish, I didn't know until like I read the book that her father was one of the attorneys for Fred Hampton, and he was an attorney. His name was Dennis Cunningham. He's an attorney for the Attica brothers. The Attica rebellion that happened in New York in 1971, and yeah, it's all correlated. So that book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, is a clear book of how lawyers could do this work. For the people. They started in Chicago, the People's Law Office, and it defended people who was activists and advocates for change in the system. And that's, that could be your role, in this movement for change.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I don't think that we've had this conversation at Penn before, at least not in the time I've been here. And so to be able to have it in such an honest way, in such a personal way, is really meaningful to us here. And we so appreciate you coming. I'd like to thank the National Lawyers Guild, the Youth Advocacy Project, and Pardon Project for all organizing this event. And really, thanks so much to all of you for coming. We appreciate it.